Hi everybody, I'm Dr. John Douillard and welcome to LifeSpa.com. And today I want to talk about the connection between your diaphragm and your emotions. New research has linked a dysfunction of your diaphragm to a higher risk or prevalence of anxiety and depression. It controls our ability to handle emotional stress. And how important is that? Something as simple as breathing can actually change how we handle emotional stress. And I want to talk to you about some of those breathing techniques, but first I want to talk about how the diaphragm works. First of all, you should know that in one study with elite professional athletes, half of them did not have a diaphragm that was relaxing and contracting fully, suggesting that most of us probably could use a little bit of diaphragmatic help, and that's what we're going to talk about. But first, let's talk about what the diaphragm does. It's a muscle, right, that contracts, and when it contracts, it pulls air in and opens up your rib cage. Your rib cage is just like a balloon. It always wants to squeeze the air out, right? If the diaphragm doesn't contract fully, the rib cage doesn't fully open. And over time, because of years of sitting, years of being sedentary, years of stress, the rib cage gets tighter and tighter and tighter. Literally, over time, becoming a cage, squeezing down our heart and lungs 26,000 times per day. Wow, it's supposed to be like 12 levers massaging your heart and your lungs 26,000 times per day. So if the diaphragm isn't contracting, because of stress and emotions and sitting, and just sitting alone, being sedentary, forces your rib cage to go down in the front, pushes your diaphragm into a pre-contracted position. So it really can't fully contract and open the rib cage because it's already pre-contracted most of the time when we sit in the car, going to the yoga class, in the front of our computer at work, or in the house watching TV or eating, so much time sitting, right? So this is a problem. You have to antidote that with breathing exercises. The diaphragm is also the #1 pump for your lymphatic system. The major part of the lymph in your body is around your belly. So studies show that the belly fat that we have is oftentimes linked to lymphatic congestion. And if the diaphragm isn't working for most folks, then that lymph's just going to sit around your belly and your hips, and you can do massive benefit for your lymph in your belly by making sure your diaphragm is functioning well. In a study with women with breast cancer, the significant number of them had congestion of the anterior diaphragmatic lymph nodes. So your diaphragm is like so important for so many things, right? Not to mention its connection to the brain. Turns out that the respiratory centers in the diaphragm and in your lungs are directly linked to the limbic system, the amygdala, the emotional centers of your brain, linked to the medulla oblongata, which is in the brainstem, which is a part of the brain that is specifically related to respiratory centers as well as emotional regulation, which is kind of really interesting. Other studies show that there are receptors, what are called mechanoreceptors in the diaphragm to help us feel information from whether you're breathing right or not, and then sending those messages to the brain to say, is it an emotional reaction or not? Think if you saw a bear in the woods, you take a upper chest gasping breath. Well, what if that bear in the woods was every day in your childhood? When you grew up in a stressful home that was maybe stressful, or there was a lot of yelling or screaming, God forbid abuse, right? This creates an upper chest style of breathing. The rib cage gets tight, the diaphragm becomes weaker, and next thing you know, your diaphragm is not functioning anywhere near the way it should. And those receptors in your diaphragm that are both in the diaphragm, mechanoreceptors, and organ receptors in the diaphragm, they actually create something that Western science calls interoception, which means the ability to feel and perceive the inside of our body. In Ayurveda, that's called self-awareness. And they developed numerous self-awareness techniques, yoga, breathing, meditation techniques, all about becoming more self-aware of the subtle. I talk a lot about how Ayurveda is all about becoming aware of the subtle. Well, in Western medicine, it's called interoception, which means that becoming aware of these subtle things, when the mechanism for that is little feelers in your diaphragm. And studies show that people who don't have good self-awareness or good interoception, they have a significant increased risk for emotional disorders. The link is there. And studies show that when people use mindful training like yoga, breathing, and meditation, they become more self-aware and then they handle emotional stress better. But it all hubs around your diaphragm. Like, how crazy is that? So learning how to breathe and using that diaphragm so it's functional again allows that diaphragm to actually be a better receiver of that internal information. That interoception or that self-awareness is naturally enhanced by the function of your diaphragm. It's like who knew how important the diaphragm was? This is just a glimpse of what the diaphragm does. Let me just digress for a second before I teach you the exercise that I want to share with you today. The diaphragm also regulates how much oxygen you take in, how much CO2 you breathe out. The diaphragm, when it contracts fully, breathes air all the way in, and if you're doing it through the nose, through these turbines, it engineers the air to go in a very small, swirling, turbocharged stream to activate all aspects of the lower lobes of your lungs. That takes time. And the more time you breathe, the longer time it takes for the oxygen to get in and exchange, and there's time for the blood to get fully oxygenated. There's also time for CO2 levels to build back up, which is how we exhale, which is what we're trying to exhale. But when you get stressed out, and we do that, after a lifetime of stress, that causes us to shallow breathe, or what Western medicine calls overbreathing. And overbreathing in one study showed that 75% of the people in America, 75% of that oxygen that they breathe in, they breathe right back out unused, right? So we're not even using the oxygen that they breathe in. So we keep trying to jam in more oxygen. The blood's already at 98% saturation. It can't take any more. And as we keep breathing more shallow, we breathe off all this excess CO2. So we have high oxygen, low CO2. Oxygen is a anxiety-provoking molecule. CO2 is a calming molecule. And that creates states of anxiety and stress and worry, and ultimately, when you get exhausted from all that, depression. So that's how that works, right? So the breathing techniques in Ayurveda called pranayama with kumbhak, and the original texts basically state that if you don't do a kumbhak or a breath hold with the breathing, it's actually not pranayama. So when you hold your breath or do long, slow breathing, the CO2 levels naturally rise. Now you have a receptor in your brainstem that actually regulates how much CO2 you're allowed to have. Now if you look at dolphins and whales, which are mammals, they have genes to allow them to handle lots and lots of CO2. And the higher the CO2, guess what happens? The oxygen in your blood, that 98% saturation in your blood, gets dumped into your tissues. So the dolphins swimming under the water for all that period of time, they're getting tons of oxygen in their tissues. They're just comfortable with the CO2 levels building up in their blood. Now, if you look at free divers who go under the water and dive under the water, the record is 25 minutes. And none of them will tell you that they're super athletes. They've trained that effect. We can retrain our brainstem to be more tolerant to CO2 levels, which means better at dumping oxygen into our tissues. And a lot of us, as we get older, diaphragm doesn't breathe well. We overbreathe and shallow breathe oxygen, CO2 levels go low, and the bond between your oxygen and your hemoglobin in your blood gets super tight. But when you let CO2 levels begin to rise, the bond gets softer and the oxygen dumps into your tissues. And as the oxygen is dumping in your tissue, if you're holding your breath or in slow, long pranayama breathing exercises, long extended breathing, the oxygen in your blood starts to dip down. And as that starts to dip down, that is what's called intermittent hypoxia. The oxygen in your tissues are being flooded with oxygen. There's tissue repair and cellular rejuvenation, but the blood is saying, hey, we're running out of oxygen. And that in Western medicine is called intermittent hypoxia. Go to LifeSpa.com, type in intermittent hypoxia, read all my articles on overbreathing, intermittent hypoxia, breath retention, kumbhak. The science is crazy. When you go into intermittent hypoxia, where the oxygen is going into your tissues and the oxygen is dipping in your blood, going from 98% saturation down into the 80s for a short, temporary, intermittent period of time, stem cells, which are repair molecules, increase. Nitric oxide, Nobel Prize winning panacea molecule, increases. EPO, Lance Armstrong got busted for erythropoietin, for for boosting endurance and energy and stamina. That's produced. Endothelial growth factors are produced. Transcription factors for your genome to protect you from genetic traits or expressions that take place from damage and stress. They're produced. Neuroplasticity, changing old patterns of your brain, lower blood sugar, lower blood pressure. I mean, it's crazy what happens when you take a little bit less oxygen in the blood. The body goes, whoa, my tissues are being saturated, but I'm running out of oxygen in my blood, which means sort of like calorie restriction, right? You don't get enough food, you get into a Nobel Prize winning autophagy, cellular repair, which is what intermittent fasting is all about. Well, you get the same thing when you lower the oxygen in your blood for a short period of time. The body sends all this repair chemistry into the system to do the repair, right? So that all translates into what? Higher levels of CO2 and higher levels of oxygen, so they're in balance. Remember, when people get panic attacks, they put a paper bag over their mouth and they rebreathe carbon dioxide, calms them down. In Ayurveda, kumbhak, on the inhalation, getting more oxygen, was used for people who were tired and lethargic and needed to be stimulated. People who were anxious were given kumbhak or breath retention on the exhalation because that would calm them down, because CO2 levels would quickly therefore rise, and that's what happens. And in the 30s and 40s and 50s, there were clinics in America for anxiety where people would breathe carbon dioxide mixed with oxygen, and they had all these incredible benefits for their anxiety. You can do that yourself by just learning how to breathe and making sure that we constantly antidote the impact of that stress on how we breathe. And over time, the rib cage becomes a cage, the diaphragm becomes weaker, and I'm not going to go into it now, but I wrote an article called Breathe Away Your Heartburn, and how breathing can lower your blood pressure, and how these breathing techniques are used in hospitals around the world for heart failure, lung failure, high blood pressure, anxiety, heartburn, reflux, and GERD. Recently approved for COVID, right? Because if your diaphragm isn't working good, that's not going to be good when you get a respiratory immune event, right? So here's the simple technique that I would suggest to start. It's a slow ujjayi breathing technique where you actually constrict the back of your throat and slow your breathing down, just creating sort of that ocean sound where it sounds something like this. Try to do a 5 to 10 count on the inhale. That was a 10 count on the inhale. Exhale, 10 count. So you just start with that. Long, slow in, whatever's comfortable. Long, slow out. Just slowly, slowly trying to extend your breath. Once you find a comfortable rhythm of that, just start introducing a little bit of a pause at the top and the bottom of each breath. Breathe in. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Inhale through ujjayi. Then hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, ujjayi. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. Super easy, super calming, really great before you go to bed, before meditation before bed, which I love. Really great way to start to lengthen your breath. Really similar, simple, easy breathing. I also wrote an article on slow breathing on my website at lifespa.com. Check that out. Check out all my articles on the diaphragm, because the diaphragm, like I said, that is the muscle that allows us to become more self-aware. According to the science, that they use the word interoception, which means becoming more self-aware. People who are more self-aware of the inner feelings of their body have significantly less emotional distress. Hard science. Read the article about the emotions and your diaphragm on my website at lifespa.com. Thanks for listening. I'm Dr. John Douillard. Do you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe and share.
This recording is brought to you by LifeSpa, where ancient Ayurvedic wisdom meets modern science. Get access to free health video newsletters by Dr. John at lifespa.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the FDA. These products are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.